My name is Bill Trine.
Could you tell us how you got to trial lawyers for public justice?
I attended a ATLA convention in Montreal, and there was a bulletin posted on a bulletin board there, just announcing that uh, lawyers were trying to get organized to form a public interest type organization that would primarily involve trial lawyers working on behalf of the public against corporate and governmental abuse. And that immediately struck me as something that I would be interested in. And the announcement said there was going to be an organizational meeting or further information at the ATLA convention that next year in San Francisco. And if I was interested in attending, I could just sign the bulletin, which I did. And I went to that convention and attended that meeting.
What kind of law did you practice that drew your interest to the public justice concept?
I clerked on the Colorado Supreme Court for 1 year. It was the first year they had clerks. And when I finished, I began practicing civil law uh, and began taking cases that I felt I could win on appeal because I had that appellate experience. So I began filing cases that no one else would file because there was no law to support them, uh, and would take them up on appeal and began making new law in Colorado in that fashion. And so the idea uh, of a national organization perhaps doing the same sort of thing nationally intrigued me. So I decided to go to the meeting in San Francisco.
What kind of cases are you talking about? Um, Corporate corruption, environmental, prison reform? What kind of cases?
The kind of cases that I had been handling since 1960, 61, were cases involving people coming to me uh, with no redress because the law wouldn't support the kind of law or the kind of case I would file, and yet they were being taken advantage of. So when I filed the cases, I assumed that the trial court would throw them out because there's no law to support them. But because of the type of case involved, I felt I could maybe make new law on appeal, and it didn't matter what kind of case. Uh, I had a product liability case against an auto company, and it, Colorado had not yet adopted strict liability. So I figured they probably would adopt that if I filed the appeal. And then people would be able to sue auto companies. And I did, and I appealed it, and they adopted new law. And I had a woman come to me uh, who was being sued for a large amount that she owed in not attending some kind of exercise ceremonies. And they were going after her employer, and she lost her job, and there was no law really to support her. So I filed a lawsuit under the restatement for civil invasion of privacy and outrageous conduct. Well, I knew the trial court would throw them out. There's no law to support them yet. And I went on appeal. And so the Colorado adopted new torts, outrageous conduct, civil invasion of privacy. And I had a case against a doctor where I made some new law and so forth. So I had done all of this before I went to Montreal and so forth. And the idea of a national organization with groups of lawyers helping out, making new law nationally, appealed to me.
Did the fact that Ronald Reagan had become president in 1980 and this so-called Reagan Revolution, which was all about deregulation, started out about deregulation, did that impact you in any way, shape, or form?
No, it didn't. Uh, that I don't even remember thinking about that. Uh, the and uh, the tort reform revolution hadn't yet started. It didn't start till 1984, 85 with ALEC. So none of that had even started yet. Uh, I, I, Ralph Nader's suggestion that lawyers take a year of absence and come to Washington, D.C. Was what I used in trying to get founders from Colorado to pay $1,000 a piece. And of course, we realized that that wasn't going to happen. So, no, there was no particular motivation at that time other than my wanting laws to change favorable to the public. And maybe if an organization could do that, I wanted to join them.
Tell us a little bit about some of the people you met.
When I went to San Francisco, uh, I met some of the people who were obviously already becoming active and trying to get something going. And they became good friends. Dean Robb was one of my closest friends. Joe Cachette was very close. Uh, and Sal Liccardo. But the people in that meeting, I would say, was the ones that influenced me the most were probably Dean Robb, Joe Cachette, Joan, of course, Claybrook, uh, and oh gosh, there were several others there. And in that meeting, it was decided that people could sign up to go back to their state and try to get contributions from new founders, $1,000 a piece. And Dean Robb approached me and said, Bill, I'm going to challenge you to see if I can get more founders from Michigan than you can in Colorado. And we'll stay in touch to see how we're doing during this next year.
The organization struggled to find your identity, what cases to take, what cases not to take, and why. One that you were involved with in 1987 regarding the Iran-Contra issue with the Christic Institute.
The Christic Institute approached public justice asking if public justice would do all of the discovery and they would try the lawsuit. They didn't want co-counsel. They didn't want someone to try it for them, but they were inexperienced lawyers who wanted someone, and they didn't have the money, and wanted someone to just do all of the discovery. And public justice didn't have much going at that time, and decided if the lawyers who would help out in public justice would fund the costs of their own discovery, and we would organize and do all that discovery for them. And so I ended up taking General Singlob's deposition for 3 days in Washington, and Adolfo Palera, and so forth. But the Christics then used all that discovery, and nevertheless, the case was thrown out and they were unsuccessful. But that was not the very first case. We were willing to take anything that would get us going to start with. So when we first got organized, Dean Robb and Joe Cachette filed a lawsuit against the FBI on behalf of a client, a woman, family from Michigan, who went to the South to help sign up people and desegregate the South in the 60s. And and the FBI was aware that she was probably going to be killed. And when she was murdered, the FBI did nothing about it. We also lost that one. And then we had a young lawyer who had just joined as a founder. And he had discovered that there was a corporation that was polluting water that was killing people. And he wanted some help with the funding, the costs. So we weren't making money on these early cases to survive. But we were willing to take anything that, in fact, would help the public out.
The water pollution case you're talking about, wasn't that one of the first times that scientific experts were brought in to serve as witnesses in trial cases?
That's correct. Scientists had been used in cases prior to that, but uh, but not to try to convince a jury that what is happening and what is occurring is tortious and should be stopped. For example, the asbestos industry and the tobacco industry were not being sued yet because it would take a lot of scientific type evidence to prove that, yes, asbestos causes mesothelioma or tobacco causes cancer and so forth. Scientists weren't being used that way to show what the corporations were doing, and that required national attention. A single lawyer in a small town couldn't possibly round up the scientists and have the money to go after cases like that. Although J.D. Lee was one of the first lawyers, he spoke at a public justice meeting one year and said, I filed a case against the tobacco industry. It wasn't successful, but it could be successful if a group of lawyers would get together and fund it and spend the time and get the scientists, you could go after the tobacco industry. Well, it fell on deaf ears. And when it really became important was starting in 1984 and 85, when the tort reform movement commenced with ALEC and ATRA and all of those corporations.
Why did this tort reform movement start?
It started that could influence legislation in every state and nationally to get rid of torts, basically. And so they started ALEC as a nonprofit corporation for that purpose. And all of the major corporations were pouring money into ALEC secretly. ALEC was was drafting legislation, and ALEC members in every state were using drafts of legislation, tort reform legislation, and introducing it in the legislatures of every state. And as a nonprofit, they didn't have to disclose their membership and where the money was coming from. And I happened to be appointed by the Colorado governor to a 29-person committee to look at legislation being introduced by a couple of Colorado legislators. That's when I first began discovering what was starting. And I didn't know until years later that ALEC had then started ATRA, and the corporation that formed small corporations in every state to fight tort reform, the Chamber of Commerce organization.
When I hear tort reform, it sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, and that's what they wanted, I think. And that's why so much of the publicity that went out by these corporations, these nonprofits, use that language frequently. But they explained it in more detail so that jurors would be influenced when they walked into the courtroom. They talked about lawyers getting ridiculous multi-million-dollar verdicts so that they could make a big fee, and on cases that shouldn't be brought. And they would pick particular cases that they would explain, look at this case. My gosh, the doctor or the corporation or whoever it was obviously isn't responsible for what happened, and yet this woman was able to collect $1 million. They made the whole tort system seem totally unfair, and how it ultimately would cost them in some fashion out of pocket. And that became a problem because jurors were influenced by that. And it took a good lawyer to find that out in a jury trial. Bush began vilifying trial lawyers generally and got national publicity by vilifying trial lawyers. It was because of Bush that ATLA decided to take the word trial lawyer out of their name. And they encouraged all the states to do that. 14 states took trial lawyers out of their name.
What do you remember specifically as being like the most important thing that happened during your time as president?
Well, I think the most important thing that happened was we were at sort of a standstill. We didn't have money producing cases. We weren't filing many laws or joining in many lawsuits, and we had an executive director who had only been with us from the beginning, who was leaving, and we needed a new executive director. So there are two things that happened. We had an executive committee meeting in Boulder in my office, and Arthur Bryant had become our first paid trial lawyer and our only employee. And we invited him to come to that meeting. we we sent him out of the room so we could discuss him, and and decided that if he would do it, we wanted him to be our new executive director, and he accepted. It also looked like we were going to run out of money, and so we got 3 or 4 people, including me, to kick in $5,000 apiece to keep our doors open. Fortunately, Arthur Bryant took over and really began working, and the fee came in, and we began being successful finally.
Some of the work you have done in the past is kind of informed or is similar to what public justice is doing with a debtor's prison project. So, can you speak a little bit to why that came to your attention, why that mattered to you?
I had a case in Colorado uh, against a jail on representing a mother whose brain damaged son was killed in the jail, and I was shocked at what was happening in our prison system and in our jails, and particularly private prisons, which I didn't know anything about. I'd never even heard of a private prison. So I gave a talk to the inner circle of advocates on the need for lawyers there to start getting involved in some prison cases. And 2 of those lawyers were public justice lawyers that I knew. And after my talk, they both came to me, George Shadoan and Sal Liccardo, and said, Bill, why don't you try to get public justice involved in this? These are important issues. And I hadn't thought about that. So I contacted Arthur Bryant and told him that I'd like to meet with the board to talk to the board about getting involved in prison cases. And I contacted someone I'd gotten to know by then, Dave Fothy, who was the director of the ACLA National Prison Project, who knew everything about prisons. I contacted Dave and said, Dave, would you join me in Washington, D.C. And help me explain the difference between the private prisons and public and everything that's going on, because you're an expert. And he said he would. So I went to the board meeting, and they were all perplexed and asked questions. And one of them said, "My God, you're talking about something that would require a ton of money and new employees." And Arthur Bryant said, agreed. He said, "We just can't do this." And I said, "Well, maybe we could limit it. Maybe we could just limit it to work with private prisons and not everything." And Arthur said, "Well, we would still have to get a new employee." And he said, "We would probably need at least $65,000 to get it started." And I said, "Why don't I try to raise 65,000 and put a plan together for the next meeting?" And he reluctantly agreed. And he assumed I couldn't do it. So in a matter of 2 or 3 months, I raised the 65,000, so they couldn't turn me down. And sure enough, they appointed Adele. But Adele said, "We need cases, though." Crowley prison riot had just happened. I got 240 cases, 240 prisoners to sign contracts who didn't participate in the uh, riot that took place. I filed 240 cases, individual cases, and joined them. And I had a wonderful case against a jail in Colorado, the Carranza Reyes case, uh, uh, who were rounding up uh, people who had immigrated to the United States from Mexico and putting them in a cell for the government, and were making a tremendous profit, sticking 60 people in a cell that was designed for 10, uh, and all of them getting sick, and we got started.
What do you see for public justice going forward?
Well, I'm hopeful that public justice will join lawyers who are starting cases that will, in fact, make a big difference if they prevail in those cases, uh, and change corporate systems and government systems. Well, such as the reform of the prison systems, uh, that 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 they'll continue doing that, only broaden it. And one day, I hope public justice has the same kind of reputation and effect as the ACLU.
This is called the Emeritus Legacy Project. So, what do you want your legacy to be?
I would love to have my legacy be uh, instrumental in having changed the prison system and jails and the so-called criminal justice system. They're all interrelated and badly in need of help. And the movement has started nationwide, uh, almost in every state, but we need more and more people involved. And I would like my legacy to be that down the road, that's changed.